Politically, Europe was divided among empires. In addition to their New World territories, Portugal, Spain, France, and England had territory in Europe similar to modern days. In the east, the Hungarian Empire controlled modern-day Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia, while the Ottoman Empire controlled Eastern Europe and modern-day Turkey. The Holy Roman Empire occupied Central Europe, and modern-day Italy was split between the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain. These empires dealt with domestic and international conflicts. The Low Countries revolted against the Holy Roman Empire from circa 1566 to 1648 and gained independence. This led to the formation of the Dutch Republic. Between 1562 and 1598, the French Wars of Religion occurred between the Protestant Huguenots and the Roman Catholics. This ended with the Treaty of Nantes, which gave the Huguenots limited religious freedom in France. Internationally, the Ottoman Empire fought the Holy League at the Battle of Lepanto and lost. A less successful conflict, the Peasants' Revolt, occurred when thousands of peasants fought against the German aristocracy, but were eventually suppressed. These conflicts set the stage for state building by ending religious and domestic turmoil. Therefore, the countries could focus on growing their empires. The economy of the Renaissance operated through trade and the money of the elite. Originally, trade with the East occurred via the Silk Road. Silk, gold, jade, tea, and spices circulated. However, trade lessened when sea routes were discovered. As a result, the Portuguese traded spices in Calcutta, India, Malacca, and other areas in the Indian Ocean, as well as areas on the coast of Africa. The Dutch traded in the Pacific with the Indonesians and Japanese. England traded in India and China and in the New World. Spain also invested in trade in the New World and discovered gold in South Africa. However, because the Spanish introduced too much gold into the economy, they later dealt with massive inflation. The domestic economy of Europe was much more centralized, as it was controlled by a few families. The Medicis were bankers in Florence who loaned money to the papacy and used their wealth to control politics. They also were great patrons of the arts. The Fuggers were merchants and bankers who loaned money to the Spanish. The elite bridged economics and politics. The Sforzas of Milan began as farmers. As their wealth grew, they took power of government in Milan. The Junkers, landed nobles of Germany, controlled much of the wealth and power of Germany.
Before the Renaissance, most of Europe was under the control of the Catholic Church. While the Renaissance strengthened the individual and thus led to a more distributed power, the Church was still incredibly powerful. However, the free-thinking and humanist outlooks caused people to recognize the corruption of the Church. While this happened at the very end of the Renaissance and even after it had ended, the Renaissance had a large part in causing the Reformation. The Renaissance has been linked very strongly to a rise in secularism. Secularism is a shift away from having religion be everything and a shift toward wanting a better life on earth, not just in heaven. This is not really a religious change, but rather a social change. The people were tired of doing the same thing over and over. They were finally wondering what else there was for them. The Renaissance was one of the first times that philosophy was developed and applied to thinking about how terrible their lives were. These people inspired the Reformation, Machiavelli's twisted writing, and everything in between. It was also very important to note that social change was not incredibly widespread. Most of the Renaissance was limited to people in the large cities of the time. Even then, not everybody in those cities was involved, just the upper class and a few other lucky and strange people. Overall, Renaissance culture caught just enough people to cause a change in how many thought of the world. It was no longer just do whatever the church told you to do. People were finally thinking for themselves.
Humanism was the intellectual movement of the Renaissance. It shifted focus from the afterlife to life in the present. Humanism stressed the importance of education and the individual as opposed to the Middle Ages' stress on the church. The Renaissance was centered in Italy and spread outward from Italy in the 1500s and 1600s. Humanism spread through Europe by schools. These schools were oriented around rhetoric and study of the Greeks. Humanism drove Renaissance through art, literature, and science. Painters, architects, philosophers, scientists, and travelers were all humanists. Authors styled literature after Greek writers. Leonardo Bruni developed the term humanism, and he said that it means new learning. Humanism was prominent in almost every aspect of the Renaissance, as well as the people experiencing its glories.
Although there are many aspects of the Renaissance, the art is one of the most important. The origin of art can be traced back to the late 13th and the early 14th centuries. This time period is known as the Proto-Renaissance, or the pre-Renaissance period. Scholars and artists thought of themselves as a reawakening to the principles and accomplishments of classical Roman culture. Writers such as Petrarch and Giovanni Boccaccio looked back to ancient Greece and Rome and sought to revive the languages, values, and intellectual traditions of those cultures after the long period of stagnation that had followed the fall of the Roman Empire in the 6th century. The Florentine painter Giotto, the most famous artist of the Proto-Renaissance, made advances in the technique of representing the human body realistically. In the later 14th century, the Proto-Renaissance was ended by plague and war, and its influence did not emerge again until the first years of the next century. This is when a sculptor named Lorenzo Ghiberti emerged and would later be named the master of early Renaissance sculpture. He won a competition that allowed him to design a new set of bronze doors for the baptistry of the Cathedral of Florence. During this competition, he always beat the architect Botticelli and young Donatello. Another major artist during this period was a well-known painter named Boccaccio, who was known for his frescoes, which were paintings done quickly in watercolor on wet plaster on a wall or ceiling. Boccaccio was a short-lived painter, as he only painted for 6 years, but he was highly influential because of his intellectual nature and naturalism in his work. The Catholic Church was a major patron of the arts during the Renaissance era, but works of art were increasingly commissioned by civil government, courts, and wealthy individuals. Much of the art produced during the early Renaissance was commissioned by the wealthy merchant families of Florence, most notably the Medici, until 1492 when Lorenzo de' Medici died. By the end of the 15th century, Rome had displaced Florence as a center of Renaissance art, reaching a high point under the powerful and ambitious Pope Leo X. 3 great masters named Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael dominated the period known as the High Renaissance, which lasted roughly from the early 1490s until the sack of Rome by the troops of the Holy Roman Empire Charles V of Spain in 1597. Leonardo was the ultimate Renaissance man, for the breadth of his intellect, interest, and talent, and his expression of humanist and classical values. Leonardo's best-known works, including the Mona Lisa, the Virgin of the Rocks, and the fresco, The Last Supper, showcase his unparalleled ability to portray light and shadow, as well as the physical relationship between figures, humans, animals, and objects alike, and the landscape around them. Michelangelo drew on the human body for inspiration and created works on a vast scale. He was the dominant sculptor of the High Renaissance, producing pieces such as the Pieta in St. Peter's Cathedral and the David in his native Florence. Though Michelangelo considered himself a sculptor first and foremost, he achieved greatness as a painter as well, notably with his giant fresco covering the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, completed over 4 years and depicting various scenes from Genesis. Raphael learned from both Da Vinci and Michelangelo. His paintings, most notably the School of Athens, painted in the Vatican at the same time that Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel, skillfully expressed these classical ideas of beauty, serenity, and harmony. Among the other great Italian artists working during this period were Bramante, Giorgione, Titian, and Correggio. Over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, the spirit of the Renaissance spread throughout Italy and into France, Northern Europe, and Spain. By the later 1500s, the Mannerist style, with its emphasis on artificiality, had developed in opposition to the idealized naturalism of High Renaissance art, and Mannerism spread from Florence and Rome to become the dominant style in Europe. Renaissance art continued to be celebrated throughout the years.